All right, so get this. Someone sent in their lecture notes on the human nervous system for us to unpack. Looks like we're in for a wild ride.
Oh, those notes sound fascinating. Where do we even start with something as complex as the nervous system?
But before we get lost in the jargon, maybe we should take a step back. Big picture, what does the nervous system actually do?
It's really quite elegant when you think about it. Basically, the nervous system is your body's command center, constantly taking in information, processing it, and then telling the rest of your body what to do.
Okay, so kind of like our internal supercomputer, taking in data, figuring it out, and then deciding on an action.
Exactly. And that entire process can be broken down into three main functions: sensory input, integration, and motor output.
Let's break that down. Sensory input, that's about gathering information, right?
Right.
Like what we see, hear, smell.
Exactly. All those senses are constantly sending reports back to the brain. Everything's transformed into signals the nervous system can actually use. It's gathering intel, if you will.
And then integration, that's where the nervous system actually figures out what all that data means.
Precisely. It's analyzing everything, comparing it to past experiences, and ultimately deciding the best course of action.
And then finally, motor output. That's the action plan, right? Like telling your hand to wave or your foot to kick.
You got it. It's the nervous system sending out commands to your muscles and glands, directing all those voluntary and involuntary actions we do all day, every day.
So it's like a well-coordinated team effort, taking in information, making sense of it, and then taking action. But how does it actually work? What are the key players here?
Well, the nervous system is divided into two main teams: the central nervous system, or CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, which we call the PNS.
Okay, two divisions. What do they each do?
Think of the CNS as your central command. It's your brain and spinal cord calling the shots. The PNS, on the other hand, is like a vast network of nerves spreading throughout your entire body, relaying messages to and from the CNS.
So the CNS is the brains of the operation, and the PNS is like the messenger service.
A perfect analogy. But here's where things get really mind-boggling. This entire system, from the simplest reflex to our most complex thoughts, it all boils down to these tiny cells called neurons.
Neurons. Aren't those the little messengers that carry information throughout the body?
That's right. Neurons are like the electrical wiring of your body sending those signals we were just talking about. And get this, each neuron has a unique lifespan. Unlike other cells, they don't divide.
So the neurons we're born with, they're the ones we're stuck with for life.
You got it. Which makes you wonder, how do these neurons get any support if they can't even divide and make new ones?
That's a good question. It's like they'd need their own little pit crew, right?
They do. And that's where glial cells come in. They're the unsung heroes of the nervous system.
Glial cells, what do they do?
Think of neurons like those high-maintenance celebrities, always needing someone to cater to their every need. Glial cells are the managers, the personal assistants, the whole crew, making sure those neurons can function properly.
So what do these different crew members actually do?
Well, take astrocytes, for example. They're like the personal assistants, making sure neurons have all the nutrients they need, cleaning up any waste, even regulating communication between those neurons.
Sounds like a pretty important job. What about these other glial cells? It's oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. What do they do?
Now, those two, they're all about speed. They're responsible for creating something called the myelin sheath, a fatty layer that wraps around the axons of neurons.
Axons, right. Those are like the long arms of the neurons, the ones that send messages.
Exactly. And this myelin sheath that the oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells create, well, it acts like insulation, just like on an electrical wire.
Insulation. So it's like putting those electrical signals in a protected tunnel. What does that actually do?
It makes those signals super fast. That myelin sheath prevents signal loss and speeds up transmission. Without it, those nerve impulses would be sluggish, our reactions would be way slower.
So it's the difference between driving on a dirt road and cruising on a superhighway. I'm starting to see why those glial cells are so important. But let's get back to those signals for a second. How do they actually travel through those neurons?
Well, think of it like electricity. Neurons communicate using these electrical signals, and we call these signals action potentials.
I think this is where those terms like membrane potential and depolarization come in. They always confuse me a bit.
They sound more complicated than they really are. Imagine a neuron as a tiny battery. When it's at rest, there's a difference in electrical charge between the inside and outside of the cell. That difference, that's the resting membrane potential.
So it's like a battery storing up energy, waiting for something to trigger it.
Exactly. Now, when a neuron receives a strong enough signal from another neuron, it triggers an action potential. It's like flipping a switch. Suddenly, the inside of the neuron becomes positively charged for a brief moment. That's depolarization. And that change in charge, it travels down the axon like a wave.
So the battery is discharging, sending out its electrical signal down the line.
Exactly. And just as quickly as it becomes positive, it resets itself, becoming negative again. That's repolarization, so it's ready for the next signal.
So it's like a constant cycle of flipping the switch on and off, happening incredibly fast.
Precisely. Think of it like a wave in a stadium. One section jumps up, then the next, and so on. It's that wave-like motion that carries the electrical signal down the neuron.
That's fascinating. But what happens when that wave, that signal, reaches the end of one neuron? How does it get to the next one?
That's where things get even more interesting. That's where the synapse comes in.
The synapse, right. That's the tiny gap between neurons. What exactly happens in that tiny space?
It's like a microscopic relay race. The synapse is where the baton gets passed from one neuron to the next.
So how does the signal make that jump?
Instead of a physical baton, the message is carried by these chemical messengers, which we call neurotransmitters.
Okay, so we're switching from electricity to chemistry here.
Precisely. When that electrical signal, that action potential, reaches the end of the axon, it triggers the release of these neurotransmitters. They essentially jump that tiny gap, that synapse, and bind to receptors on the receiving neuron.
Like a key fitting into a lock.
You got it. And that binding triggers a new electrical signal in the next neuron, and the chain of communication continues.
So it goes electrical signal, then chemical signal, then back to electrical.
You're getting it. And just like there are different keys for different locks, there are all kinds of neurotransmitters, each with a specific message to convey. And it's fascinating to think about how many different kinds of messages are being sent at any given time. It's not just about a signal being sent, it's about what that signal means.
So it's more than just an on-off switch. It's like a whole language with different signals having different meanings.
Precisely. Some neurotransmitters tell the next neuron to fire, and those are called excitatory. Others tell the next neuron to hold off, and those are called inhibitory. It's all about balance.
So it's like this constant dance between excitation and inhibition, with billions of neurons all firing at different rates, influencing each other.
Exactly. And all of this is happening in milliseconds. It's this amazing symphony of activity that underpins our every thought and action and feeling.
It's mind-boggling. But there's one thing I'm still a little fuzzy on. These notes mention something called synaptic delay. What is that exactly?
Synaptic delay. It's a tiny, tiny time lag that happens between the arrival of a signal at the synapse and the generation of a new signal in the next neuron.
Okay, a tiny lag. Why does that matter?
Well, it's only a fraction of a millisecond, but when you consider just how many neurons and synapses there are in the brain, all those tiny delays add up.
So even though each delay is super short, it could have a big impact on how the brain works overall.
Absolutely. Think of it like playing a video game. Even a slight delay in your controller can make a difference, right? It's all about timing and coordination. Synaptic delay is key in how our brains process information.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not just a technical detail. It's a key part of how our brains function. But this is all happening on a microscopic level. How does this system of neurons and synapses actually translate to, well, us?
That's where the brain and spinal cord come in. That's the central nervous system, the command center of it all.
Let's talk brain. It's the organ we usually think of when we think nervous system. And for good reason. It's responsible for everything that makes us, us.
Right. The brain is like the CEO, making decisions, storing memories, processing everything. But it's not a one-man show. The brain is divided into different departments, each with its own specialty.
The cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Can we start with the cerebrum? That sounds like a big one.
It is. It's the largest part of the brain and the most highly developed. It's what most people picture when they think of a brain. That wrinkled, grayish-pink mass.
Classic brain image. What's it actually in charge of?
Think of the cerebrum as your thinking cap. It's responsible for conscious thought, your senses, language, memory, voluntary movements, the list goes on.
Wow, so it does a lot. And the notes mention that it's divided into two hemispheres. Is that like having two brains?
In a way, yes. While the two hemispheres are constantly working together, they each have their own specialties. The left hemisphere is usually better at things like language processing, logic, analytical thinking, while the right hemisphere is more about spatial awareness, creativity, recognizing emotions.
It's like having a logician and an artist sharing an office.
Precisely. And here's a fun fact. Each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. So if you move your right hand, that signal actually originated in the left side of your brain.
No way. That's
Yeah.
so weird to think about. Okay, so that's the cerebrum, the thinker and planner. What about the cerebellum? Where does that fit in?
The cerebellum is all about movement. It's like the master coordinator, making sure all our movements are smooth and precise.
So if the cerebrum decides on a movement, the cerebellum makes sure it happens smoothly and correctly.
Exactly. Whether you're walking, dancing, playing an instrument, or just standing upright, that's your cerebellum at work behind the scenes, receiving information, making tiny adjustments.
Like a built-in choreographer we never even think about.
Exactly. And we would be lost without it. Our movements would be jerky and uncoordinated.
Okay, so we've covered the cerebrum, the thinker, and the cerebellum, the smooth operator. What about the brainstem?
The brainstem often gets overlooked, but it's absolutely essential for life. It controls all those vital functions we never think about, things like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, even swallowing.
Those two seem pretty important.
Right, it's like the control center for all those automatic functions that keep our bodies running.
So it's like the silent workhorse of the nervous system,
Right.
quietly doing its job 24/7.
Exactly. It's constantly monitoring our internal environment, making adjustments as needed. Without it, we wouldn't last very long.
It's incredible to think how much is going on in our brains at any given moment. We've covered the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the brains. That's a lot of brain power. But what about the spinal cord? How does that fit into all of this?
Ah, the spinal cord. It's like the information superhighway that connects your brain to the rest of your body.
So it's like a giant cable carrying messages.
Exactly. Sensory information from the body travels up the spinal cord to the brain, and then motor commands from the brain travel back down the spinal cord to the muscles and glands.
So it's a two-way street, this constant flow of communication between brain and body.
Exactly. But the spinal cord is more than just a messenger, it's also involved in reflexes.
Reflexes. You mean like when you accidentally touch something hot and jerk your hand back?
Exactly. Reflexes are those super fast automatic responses that don't require any conscious thought.
So how does that work? Does the signal still have to travel all the way to the brain and back?
Nope. That's what's so cool about reflexes. They actually bypass the brain entirely. So the sensory information, like from your hand touching the hot stove, travels to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord immediately sends out a motor command to your muscles to move your hand.
So it's like a shortcut in the system, a way to react super fast in emergencies.
Exactly. Reflexes are crucial for our survival.
It's amazing the things our bodies do without us even realizing it. I mean, we think of ourselves as being in control, but our spinal cord is over here saving us from danger without even consulting us.
Right, and that's just one example of how the spinal cord is working behind the scenes to keep us safe and functioning. It really is a vital part of the central nervous system.
Okay, so we've got the central nervous system, the brain, and spinal cord running the show. But what about the rest of the body? That's where the peripheral nervous system comes in, right?
You got it. The peripheral nervous system, or PNS, is like a vast network of nerves branching out from the central nervous system, reaching every single part of your body.
So it's like the communication network, relaying messages between headquarters and, well, everywhere else.
The perfect analogy. Now, the PNS has two main divisions, according to these notes. We've got the sensory division and the motor division.
Okay, two branches. What do they each do?
The sensory division, or afferent nerves, they're like the intelligence gatherers. They collect information from the outside world and send it back to the brain.
And the motor division. Those nerves carry messages from the brain, right?
Exactly. Those are the efferent nerves, telling muscles to contract, glands to secrete, you name it. They're the action team. But it gets even more interesting. The motor division also has a branch called the autonomic nervous system. That's the part we don't even have to think about.
That's my kind of system. The stuff that just happens automatically, like breathing and digestion.
You got it. The autonomic nervous system keeps things running smoothly in the background. Heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, all that good stuff. We don't have to lift a finger.
Sounds like a pretty sweet deal. But let's go back to those sensory nerves for a minute, those intelligence gatherers. How do they actually collect information?
Well, we have these specialized cells called sensory receptors, and they're all over our body. They're like tiny sensors, each one designed to detect a specific type of stimulus.
So like different sensors for different senses.
Exactly. Mechanoreceptors for pressure and vibration, thermoreceptors for temperature, photoreceptors for light.
Wait, photoreceptors, those are the ones in our eyes, right?
That's right. And then we have chemoreceptors for taste and smell. And of course, we can't forget about nociceptors.
Nociceptors. Those don't sound as fun.
Those are the ones responsible for pain.
Good.
But hey, pain is important. It's our body's way of telling us something is wrong.
True. Better to feel the pain than to not know you're hurt. So these sensory receptors, they're sending information through nerves, right? Those bundles of fibers we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Nerves are like those fiber optic cables, carrying tons of information through electrical signals. And each nerve contains bundles of axons from different neurons, kind of like how those cables have different colored wires inside.
So it's like a superhighway with different lanes for different kinds of sensory information. That's pretty cool. But what about those cranial nerves? Those are
Well,
important, right?
absolutely. Cranial nerves are a special set of nerves. There are 12 of them, and they come directly from the brain, not the spinal cord.
What do they do?
They control things like our senses, like sight, smell, taste, and hearing. But they also control things like facial expressions and movement.
So when I'm enjoying the smell of my coffee in the morning, I can thank my cranial nerves for that.
You got it. And hey, when you're listening to the podcast, you can thank your cranial nerves for that too.
That's amazing. I never thought about it like that. Well, this has been quite the deep dive. We've gone from those tiny neurons to the vast network of nerves that make up the peripheral nervous system. It's incredible to think how much is going on in our bodies every second without us even realizing it.
It really is. And the more we learn about it, the more amazing it becomes.
And on that note, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today. From the complexities of synaptic transmission to the vital roles of our different brain regions and the incredible reach of the peripheral nervous system, it's clear that the nervous system is a marvel of biology. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the incredible world of the human nervous system. Until next time.
See you next